For some reason, the shift cable on our car that goes front to back on the transmission is the one that always seems to fail. And this one's got a lot of rust on it, so I thought I would throw it in some rust release, which is really the same as Evapor Rust as far as I can see. I bought a gallon of it to see if it was any better than Evapor Rust, but it's not. So I'd say just keep going to Harbor Freight and getting Evapor Rust. But I wanted to get rid of this rust so I could paint it and make it look a little better. So this is how I did it. I just took a plastic tube. It's one of those split tubes. In this case it was a 1-inch DeWalt bit tube. So I just used the cable inside it, and hopefully tomorrow that'll look nice. And on the car, that's the cable that goes front to back. And as you can see, without the heater core bypass and the vacuum booster, there's a lot more room in here to get at those cables. I know they used to be a real bear to get at, and now it shouldn't be too bad. But just keep in mind when you're working with the cables, the left-right on the transmission is the front-back on the shifter. And obviously the front back on the transmission is the left right on the shifter. So it's backwards from what you would expect, but that's the way it works. This is the shift cable after it came out of the rust remover. So you can see it looks pretty good. So the problem is it has a ripped boot. And this is the front back cable on the transmission. That tends to be the cable that fails all the time. For some reason the left-right cable doesn't fail and this one does. So as you can see, I have a ripped boot. So what I'm going to do is remove some of the boot. So that leaves me with just the cable. Actually, this one's a little bent now that I look at it. Straighten that up. So this is the Mercury outboard motor bellows. I'm going to cut it here. So what I'm looking to do is secure the front of the boot around this area. I want to make sure I have one extra pleat. When I do that, I have something to bite onto. So I'm going to lock it onto here. And for the back, I want to secure it behind this boot. And make sure you have it extended so you can get a feel for how everything's coming together. can leave this fat section. You can't leave it over this area because that's where the clip is going to go. That secures the cable to the transmission. You can see there's no interference on that area. I'll probably trim that. As far as functioning, it goes in and out okay. One thing I just figured out was when I was working the cable back and forth, it would actually create a vacuum in here until it gave it a few seconds to replenish the air. So what I did was I just put a little cut in the back side of this boot. So now it moves. You can actually feel the air blowing out of it. So I think that's an important part of this bellows. Make sure you have a little vent hole so that air can escape. You shouldn't have any vacuum in here when you're trying to extend it. When you go to bring your shift cable through the floor, the cable that does the left to right on the transmission is the front to back on the shifter. So that's going to come in on the right side of the shifter bracket. It's easiest if you take this housing off. It gives you a lot more room to work, and then you can put this center section back on before you try to relocate the dash. But if you're going to do it, take the plastic console out and this metal bracket, and that'll give you a lot more access. The factory has a rubber boot for the shift cables. That goes through the floor. The cables feed through that. And then I made up my own stop ring that goes on the outside from underneath. It'll go up against it. So I don't have the original setup that the factory had. They're kind of flimsy. Since I had put a bigger hole in the floor of my car, it kind of gives me complications. I had a different setup in there a few years ago. So what I needed to do was to make some shims. So I've got this one, which is going to go up from the bottom against the tunnel. The rubber boot that's split, and then this lock ring which goes around the outside of the rubber boot. And the outer ring which will go on to sandwich it. So this will be how it goes against the car. Shift cable is going in here. I've also got nut certs on the transmission tunnel so I can bolt it all in from the outside. So that's how it sits. I can't even remember how the original way was, but this works for me. Of course, you got to put the cables through this boot, through all the rings, and then with this boot before you can stick everything up into the car. All right, now you can see that both shift cables are in. Shift boots are on. I actually think these Mercury boots are pretty good. They barely fit through the holes, but they do fit through. You just have to kind of extend them a little bit to get them through. But also, I'm not sure if everyone's aware, this clip that's on the front to back cable, that's not on the older cars. That was something that was added in the late 80s, I believe it was, to keep the cable from popping off because they were having issues with cables popping. So if you don't have one, I'm not sure if they're still available or not, but you definitely want to find a way to attach your cable to that lug on the shifter. The one way to do it is to put a tie wrap around the whole cable head. If you were to put a tie wrap around here, that would probably do the same thing to lock that down. As it is, these are really hard to get the cable in, and therefore hard to get them out too, so that's a good thing. Again, I put a hole in this boot to give it some breathing. I don't have a hole in this one. I got to see if that's going to be an issue or not. I may have to add a hole, but probably not. It's big enough, and it's probably got an air gap in there somewhere. So now I'm going to hook up the shifter to the cables. And for those of you that aren't familiar with how to do it on a manual transmission, we have this center pin, and you take the pin out, flip it upside down, and put it down into the shift housing. And when this shifter linkage is in the neutral position on the transmission, front to back, side to side, it'll actually go all the way down in and lock into a hole. At that point, you come inside the car, you've got your shift linkage and your cable, and you need to put this bolt right in the center of the cable. So that will align everything and give you neutral position on your shifter and on the transmission. Now, one thing you can see here, this cable going in the bottom is a good 1.25 inches or so below the shift linkage. That's because I actually I have to modify it to be up here. So the cable should actually be mounted up here. I've got to redo the positioning on that. This shifter has a short shift, but I only put it on one of the shift sides. I didn't want the left to right to be any closer. I just wanted the front to back to be closer. So we've actually altered the far shifter so that the linkage is a couple inches longer, and that gives me a shorter front to back shift, but I still get the same side to side shift. I had tried actually doing the short shift on side to side, but it was just too close. I was missing more gears than it was worth. So I decided to just do half the short shift and modified it so that only the only the front to back shift is shorter. So this is how the shifter locator looks when it's upside down. It does thread in, and then on the inside you're locating your cable in the center. In this case it's left to right, and on the other side it's front to back. So both cables get indexed so that the bolt's dead center in the slot, and that should make everything right. As you can see, I have adjusted, I've moved my cable up to the top bracket, and then the other one's in the low bracket. To get this shift cable set up to work, I actually had to end up adding another collar to it on the outside. So I took this old suspension part for the strut towers to modify it and put it in there. Again, this setup is not ideal because it requires pulling both cables if you're going to replace one. So if you can live with the stock setup, I suggest you do that, but I went down the rabbit hole long ago, so that's no longer an option. The good news is you don't replace shift cables that often, hopefully, unless you live in the salt regions. So you can see how the cables are routed in here now.